Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. We're just going to wait a minute as everybody files into the meeting, and then we'll get things started.
As we were keeping an eye on the registrations, we're all very excited to see where everybody was coming in from. While we wait, if we took a couple minutes here, if people wanted to add where you're connecting from in the chat, that would be just a fun thing to get the ball rolling as we wait a couple more minutes to get started. Oh goodness. Well, I realize that there is no chat, but either way, excited to see everybody here. Thanks for joining us.
Okay, well, let's get things started. Hopefully, we'll leave things open so a few more people can join. First and foremost, we wanted to welcome you and to thank you for your interest in this project. We're really thrilled to have you join us today and to share some information about this exciting initiative. Waterfront ReConnects is a joint project that is being led by the Bentway Conservancy, the Waterfront BIA, the Toronto Downtown West BIA, and the City of Toronto. My name is Elena Altman. I'm the co-executive director of the Bentway, and I'm joined by my colleague, Sam Carter-Schmey, as well as Tim Coker, who is the executive director of the Waterfront BIA. And we have prepared a brief presentation, overview of the project objectives, as well as some key requirements of the EOI, but we'll make sure that we leave ample time for questions at the end. I wanted to begin today's session by acknowledging that the Bentway and the Gardiner Expressway operate on the treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit and the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, the Métis, and many other Indigenous nations. We acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and Takaranto, the place in the water where the trees are standing, is now home to many diverse Indigenous people. We recognize them as the past, present, and future caretakers of this land. As I mentioned, we will be sure to leave ample time to address anybody's questions. Hopefully you've had a chance to review the call for expression of interests, but if any questions come up during our presentation that remain unanswered, you can submit them through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll come back to them at the end of the presentation. This session includes captions for accessibility, and just wanted to make everybody aware that this session is being recorded and will be made available in YouTube as a reference in the coming days. So again, if you know somebody who wasn't able to join us here today, the recording will be made available at a later date. Sam, did you want to bring up the presentation?
Here we go.
Great. And I think you can flip straight to the next slide. So for those of you from outside Toronto, I wanted to begin by familiarizing you with our site of intervention, which is the Gardiner Expressway. The Gardiner is an elevated highway that was built in the mid-20th century and stretches the length of Toronto's downtown core. It was built, as many pieces of infrastructure of this period were, in a highly single-purpose way, with the goal of connecting the downtown to the growing suburbs by car. And it was built at a time when the waterfront was a very different place, was largely industrial, and was divided from the city by rail lines. But almost as quickly as the Gardiner was built, the waterfront began to change, and industrial properties have been redeveloped for residential and recreation purposes. And today, Toronto's waterfront is a thriving part of our city, representing Toronto's past and future. But unfortunately, the Gardiner at grade remains a significant obstacle and a point of division. Waterfront ReConnect looks at how the Gardner can be repositioned as a primary gateway to the waterfront and become a much more integrated part of the urban landscape. And I think as we've all learned during the pandemic, these crucial points of connection in our city and public spaces have never been more important. The Waterfront ReConnect projects also builds on the goals and ambitions of the Bentway project, which the first phase of which was opened in 2018 on the west end of the city between Strachan Avenue and Fort York Boulevard, indicated here in the dark yellow shaded area. The Bentway reimagined the Undergardner spaces in this area as both a key connection between neighborhoods in the vicinity, as well as an open and welcoming public space that serves as a vital public resource and a year-round site for free programming. If you flip to the next slide, Sam, you can see that the diversity of our programming and the uses of the space changes season over season, year over year. But all of our programming aims to foster conversations about the changing nature of the city and its many communities. And we are really excited to be participating in this project because we feel it continues that tradition as we explore alongside all of you the possibilities for hybrid infrastructure. And I'll pass it on to Tim to say a few words about the origin of the ReConnect project.
Thanks, Alana. Yeah, I was just going to speak about the background and why the BIAs are involved in this. About 3 years ago, I started working at the Waterfront BIA, which is essentially south of the Gardner. And what they had identified as a problem for years here was that to get to the beautiful and increasingly beautiful waterfront, you have to go under these disgusting, dirty underpasses onto the highway. And so when I was here, luckily there was a precedent being set by the Bentway that was starting then, and the Waterfront Toronto had done some work with Underpass Park, etc. There was clearly like a better path to having a more welcoming, friendlier underpass connection. And so we had gotten a vision done called Waterfront ReConnect by Ken Greenberg and Public Work, who were of course instrumental in starting the Bentway. So that's the impetus. The pilot project that's shown here was something we had initially funded and got completed in 2019. And then the projects we're working on right now are essentially the funding we had committed for up to 2 more pilots with another BIA, Downtown West, formerly known as Entertainment District BIA, and also with contributions, major contributions from the city who worked with BIAs on projects like this. And Ilana, if you don't mind, I should mention one of the cautions. We're obviously excited for what the designers are going to come up with, and kudos to the Bentway for now being I call them the spiritual leader of all of the underpass connections into the future. And what you're looking at here is like an example of some of the limitations you have to be flexible to deal with. The original designer plan and vision was to paint the underside of the pillars as well on the bottom. The rendering originally had gold painted on the bottom of those, but due to multiple city departments having complications that could not be coordinated, the designers ended up changing their design slightly to come up with something they were comfortable with that didn't have gold on the underside of the Gardner, but still kind of had their vision in tune. So I just wanted to mention that as sort of an example of how these projects tend to evolve this to sort of deal with the cities. We had to deal with 10 different departments to get the first pilot project done, and the Bentway is smoothing that process, but it'll still be complicated. Thanks, Lana.
Thanks, Tim. So as Tim mentioned, these series of interventions are pilots or early demonstration projects of what might be possible as the Gardner continues to transform. The Gardner is undergoing a significant rehab process at the moment where there's new investment being placed in the deck. And so these will be temporary interventions that will be in place for a few years before that deck rehab work takes place. But we think these are really important near-term opportunities to advance a series of emerging principles for the public realm and to shape the Undergardner corridor and this piece of urban infrastructure in the future. The principles and objectives that are key priorities for us and our partners are, of course, as we've mentioned, moving away from the perception of the Gardner as an obstacle to a new point of connection and creating inviting and accessible physical and visual connections that link community assets and transportation hubs, both east-west and north-south. A prioritization of the public realm. The Bentway and many other new parks and public realm investments in the area are creating a network of linked public spaces that improve the safety and accessibility of the Undergardener area and increasingly support a diversity of use for these spaces. We also recognize that the Gardner is a very unique structure, and the neighborhoods in which it's situated are equally unique and change considerably along its length. And we want to ensure that these responses are harnessing the unique character of both the infrastructure and the surrounding neighborhoods. They're built features, but even more importantly, the multi-layered histories that have been defined by distinctive communities over time. As Tid mentioned, there's a lot of operational considerations that will be reflected in the design brief that will be issued to shortlisted proponents. The Gardner is an active piece of infrastructure. It remains an active highway. And as a result, there are annual maintenance cycles that designers will need to be aware of, and a necessity to have ongoing access for both emergency and planned maintenance. But we think that there's still huge possibilities for, as I said, prioritizing the public realm while still providing the necessary provisions for this type of ongoing upkeep. We're also hoping that designers can think carefully and to provide creative solutions for equitable and sustainable growth that address some of the longstanding environmental and social issues that have been tied to the Gardner Expressway, and to ensure that as the nature of this structure changes over time, that it's creating a healthy and supportive space for all Torontonians. And then lastly, we are eager to think about the city's recovery and resilience following COVID, and how the optimization of a piece of public infrastructure for active transportation, programming, and for increased public use can help to meet some of the city's goals in its recovery efforts. And with that, I will pass it on to Sam to go through some of the details of the expression of interest.
Thanks, Alana. So at this point, I'll sort of carry through and try to cover in a little bit greater detail what was contained in the expression of interest and what we're hoping to receive back from all of the interested parties. So just to start with, as I think just to start by introducing who has been collaborating on this project. Obviously, Tim is representing the Waterfront Business Improvement Area. There ourselves, the Bentway. We're also working with Toronto Downtown West Business Improvement Area, and of course the city. And sort of has been alluded to, this is a two-stage design process. So we've started with this expression of interest to provide a high-level indication of the project, but as Alana mentioned, once we identify shortlisted proponents, we'll be providing a much more detailed design brief that gets into the nuts and bolts. One piece that I guess I just want to note as we carry through, I want to orient not just where we are in the city, but what is the significance of, really set the stage. What is the significance of this project? What is the significance of the Gardner? And what is the opportunity that is before us? Because this is really what we're trying to explore here. So I think as Alana was starting to get to, this demonstration project is meant to reflect a sort of a yes and approach to civic infrastructure. It's not exactly an exercise in adaptive reuse so much as it's an exercise in active reuse. The Gardner, if we think about it at a regional scale, the Gardner is a key artery, not just for the city of Toronto, but it's really one of the, if we think about the extension to the QEW and going further afield, it is a key connector within the region. But at a local scale, we face some challenges. And it's one of the sort of high-level questions that we're trying to get into is how do we reconcile these issues of scale? How do we reconnect the city with arguably our greatest natural resource, the lake itself? And how do we emphasize the importance of public space, which I think has been one of the key lessons that we've all sort of gotten a handle on firsthand over this past year. It's not just about the importance of public space for our physical or mental well-being. It's about our social well-being as a city. It's about our economic well-being as places to do business. And environmental impacts as well, again, thinking about that regional and high level scale. So to introduce the sites at a little bit greater detail, I want to start with the Simcoe intersection. Again, before we get right down to the sites of themselves, I wanted to take a note to just allude to what's, sorry, I'll flip back to the last slide, just, oops. To position these again within the local adjacencies. And so the Simcoe intersection you see here is just to the east of Roundhouse Park, and immediately south of it is the power plant and the Harbourfront Center. So really we're anchored on both sides by sort of key destinations, whereas York Street intersection is grounded at all four corners by residential development. And so I think these are different but indicative examples of the various ways that these intersections reflect the way that our downtown has changed, from large-scale destinations and adaptive reuse projects like Roundhouse Park and the power plant, to the introduction of all of these vertical communities and the places of life and home that are being made down there. I see that we've got a question about some of the local challenges, and that's what I'm hoping to get into in a little bit more detail as we go through these some site photos and walk through the intersections themselves. So I've got a couple of images that will hopefully help to illustrate this, but right off the top, Simcoe is a wider expanse of the covered space. We don't just have the main deck of the Gardiner here, but on both sides, it's flanked by elevated on and off ramps. And so it's a much wider crossing. It's effectively a three-stage intersection that you need to cross as a pedestrian. To the south of the intersection, which you can kind of see in this top right corner, is an active parking garage, which I think creates a really interesting visual backdrop, but is not exactly the most animated function. And so really this is about how do we draw people from the destinations to the northeast through to the waterfront itself. Looking a little bit closer at the sort of the elements of the intersection itself, here again, top left, you can sort of see the width of the covered area. You can also note that there are these generous medians, and we're looking at these as some of the more interesting elements, particularly this piece in the middle on the east side of the intersection, which connects all the way over to the base of the 10 York Street condominium. Having done a little bit of site research and observation, it was interesting to note that this is actually one of the more frequented pedestrian corridors because people are coming directly from the building over at York Street, which is the next intersection. Again, top right here, you can see the extended covered area, which is covered by this off-ramp on the left side here. Actually, this is the on-ramp, sorry. But again, you have these wide median areas or enhanced sidewalk areas that are just asking for something to be done with them. So these are both of the north side. Looking at the photos we have on the south, on the bottom half of the page, so the bottom left here is an example, a photo of the southwestern corner of the intersection. You have the traffic coming off of the highway here, which is I think something we want to be aware of, as well as this condition right at the base here. Again, a generous median space between the two vehicle traffic lanes, but it's unpaved. And then looking finally at the northwest corner, this ramp comes down right off of the Roundhouse Park, where you have big destinations like the Rogers Center, the Aquarium, the CN Tower, but it sort of comes right down the hill to the intersection itself. And we also see a number of utility boxes in this corner. And so each sort of section of the intersection, I think, has opportunities and constraints, but this is precisely what we're looking to get feedback on. Shifting to York Street, as I mentioned a couple minutes ago, it's a sort of different character just in terms of the immediate adjacencies. Here, I really like to think about way that our downtown has transformed to accommodate these vertical communities. And so whereas the Simcoe adjacencies speak to the larger sort of regional draws and destinations, here I think it's important to consider the way that the public realm serves as the living rooms and backyards and porch spaces of these residential communities. As I mentioned earlier, all four corners of this intersection are anchored by residential towers. And if we think about a little bit broader afield, the types of destinations you have in close proximity are, say, the ferry docks that are just a little bit further east on the waterfront side. And this again speaks to that essential nature of the public realm for those who live in vertical communities. It's because we are at the base of the on-ramp at York Street intersection, we don't have quite as large an expanse of covered area. And similarly, the crossing is a little bit more straightforward. It's only a two-stage pedestrian crossing here. Another thing that I think is important to note at the York Street intersection is that because of the residential towers that I've mentioned at the four corners, we are seeing some public realm improvements and landscaping that has been introduced on the south side. So on the bottom right of the screen here, you can see some of the street furniture and the bike parking that is located at the base of the 10 York building. On the opposite side of the street, you can see some of the landscape planting at the base of 1 York, which is again at the southeast corner of the intersection. So it's again these median areas and the intersections themselves, the zebra crossings, that I think are the logical sites of intervention. Of course, the constraints that we need to contend with that I think both Alana and Tim have made reference to are largely driven by the maintenance and upkeep requirements of the structure itself. Again, this is an active piece of infrastructure and it's an important connector regionally, and as we can improve it at a local scale too. And so we'll have to contend with the requirements for access to the objects like the utility boxes, as well as the stormwater downspouts from the Gardner, and simply the columns, the vents that support the elevated structure themselves. Let's see, I just want to make sure I didn't miss anything, but I think that about covers this introductory, just situating what the sites are. Again, as we move forward with the shortlisted proponents, we'll be providing a much greater level of detail as to what the specs are of the both intersections and what the available areas for intervention are, and what types of interventions might be situated where. But we're hoping to receive a broad spectrum, and so at this point wanted to leave it open so that we can not close doors prematurely. Really want to see what everybody is able to come up with, because this is really the exciting part. Oops, I missed a slide there. Okay, so with that in mind, the applications are being open to artists and professional artists and professional designers to interact and propose solutions for this space. We want us to be if we've made it a national call because we don't just want localized, we want the fresh perspectives and bright ideas from across the country. We want to see critical perspectives on public space as informed by various backgrounds and disciplines and locations. We want to see the art and provocations, participatory design thinking as might be applied to this site. And yeah, recognizing that it is going to be installed for a temporary period, but a duration in the public realm in a relatively sort of harsh condition, we need, and because we're partnering with the city to implement this, there is a requirement that there be a licensed engineer or architect on each of the design teams, but we're really hoping to get really creative feedback and approaches, and so wanted to include, be explicit to include and encourage artists to engage with this prompt as well. Moving along, the way that we're going to be sort of processing and evaluating the submissions that we receive in response to the expression of interest is along the following sort of 3 terms. And we'll just shortly, I'll get into sort of how we're going to rank these. But first and foremost, we want to know about the approach and methodology. This is your opportunity to tell us about how do you understand the challenge before us? How are we, not so much what are you going to propose, because we recognize that this is early and we need to provide the detailed design brief, but more so an opportunity to tell us about how are you thinking about it? How is your design philosophy going to be applied to this particular challenge? For this section, looking for about 1,000 words, a 2-page limit. Regarding relevant project experience, and I've noticed there was another question to this point, and so I hope I can help clarify here. We want to see past relevant experience, both from an artistic perspective, but also, and I think importantly, art as applied to urban exposition. We want to know that this is something that our teams have been familiar with and are able to execute and deliver on, is sort of what we're looking for there. And again, similarly, how have you in the past approached these sort of contentions that we run up against in public realm art installations and interventions? For this section, we're looking for 3 pages worth of references. That is not to say that we're looking for a minimum number of projects, but we figured 3 is probably a good number. If it's more or less what you can fit on 3 pages, rather. And then finally, what is the makeup of the team? So here's where we want to know the personnel, their experience and qualifications. I can't help myself sometimes. I, especially these days, have been watching some Olympics. This is the chance to introduce your starting lineup. Like who's here on the team and what does everybody bring to the table? And again, for this section, maximum of 8 pages and a 1-page CV introducing each person. Just before I move on, because I think there's a couple other questions that are relevant here. There's one question being asked about a professional artist as a required member of the team. It's either a design firm with, so no, a professional artist is not a required component of the team makeup, but would be encouraged. And we're also looking to, yeah, it would be encouraged, and partnerships is what we'd love to see. We, as I mentioned before, though, we will need a licensed architect or engineer to be part of that part of the and just a little bit more clarification here. The question about max submission length of 8 pages for the CVs, that is 1 page max, like 1 page per CV up to a maximum of 8 pages. And I will just move on. Some of the other questions about duration of the pieces, I think we can speak to at the end, but I do want to just finish off a few other pages here. So finally, the evaluation sort of matrix. How are we going to assess and measure all of the great proposals that we're looking forward to receiving? We've set up a sort of basic rubric for our own use, which will correspond to those 3 categories that I just introduced. The approach and methodology section is going to be weighted slightly higher for a total of 40 points out of our total of 100, whereas the team composition and the personnel experience and qualifications are 30 points each. This will give us sort of a quantitative baseline that will inform our preliminary ranking and understanding, and then we'll follow that up with a sort of detailed discussion among the project partners to really come to our final deliberation and decisions, at which point our shortlisted teams will be contacted and we'll move on to the next stage of the interview, of the competition rather.
And just to confirm, we're looking to shortlist up to 3 teams per intersection.
Yes, that was the total 6 teams, 3 per intersection is our intention.
Sam, thanks so much for addressing so many of these questions as you were going through the slides. I'm just looking back to see what we might need to come back to. There was a question about applicants' equity, diversity, and inclusion statements having weight on the final decision, and how lived experience would be taken into account. I would encourage you to share those perspectives in the methodology section in the statement of intent. I think a relationship and understanding of it, differing relationships and understanding of the city are really critical, and we greatly encourage applications from a broad diversity of applicants. So I would encourage you to make that experience known in the methodology section if you want to draw it to our attention. And there was a question about whether this is intended to be a permanent work. So the answer is this is intended to remain in place until the deck rehab work that is planned for this section roughly around 2028 takes place. So it will be a work that would be in place for a number of years, but not permanent. And we're very much thinking about these as demonstration projects, pilot projects that will test what is possible as longer term interventions for the intersection are explored following the deck rehab work. So I think there was a question here about what is the intention for long-term artistic experience. The answer is we don't yet know, but we're probably looking into 2030 before the deck rehab work is complete in this area, at which time more permanent interventions would be possible.
Again, we're hoping that the lessons that we can draw out of this window of these temporary installations can certainly be applied as we build back on these particular intersections, but hopefully they can be lessons that we can draw out and extrapolate for broader application across similar conditions, whether it's elsewhere on the Gardner corridor or elsewhere in the country. Because we know that this is not it's a distinct site, but this is not an entirely unique condition. And so we're hoping that these test interventions can really demonstrate the potential of alternate approaches.
It's asking a question about whether a professional architect or engineer will be required to stamp the drawings. And yes, that is why that is a requirement for the team composition. Somebody has asked about qualifications and previous experience and how that will be assessed. I think that the reason that we're asking for a demonstration of previous experience is to clearly understand that people have the ability to work at scale and on a timeline and on a complex multi-stakeholder project like this. But our intent is not to evaluate the previous designs as precedent for what would be proposed. The goal is to support new creative interventions that are responding specifically to the call. There's a couple of questions here, Sam, that maybe you can address about whether people can apply for one intersection or the other, and how the request for expression of interests is framed.
We are hoping that we'll receive applications for both intersections, although we're not requiring proponents to not requiring them to address both. Really, we want to see what are the best ideas that you have to offer that could be applied to these intersections. If it's tailored to one or the other, that will inform our decision making. Again, as Juana mentioned, we want to shortlist 3 teams per intersection. And so if everybody is applying for, listing a certain, say, York Street as their preferred intersection, that will mean that competition is that much tougher to make our selection out of. Does that starts to address the question? We're not limiting it to one or the other, or certainly a requirement for both. Really, we want to see what is the best and most exciting ideas that you have to propose, and that will really drive our evaluation.
Somebody has asked about the contract type. We should specify that the BIA office will be working as the delivery agent for the project. So we will be looking for designers to deliver tender-ready drawings, but we will be working closely with the technical advisory throughout the competition to make sure that the proposals are vetted for operational considerations and implementation has been considered. But that's the way that the delivery would be structured.
There's a question I see here around accessibility accommodations for the application process, and we haven't laid it out in the expression of interest, but we really, if you need any accessibility accommodations, please contact us directly and we can figure out how we can best support your needs, basically, because again, we really want to make sure that we get a broad spectrum of perspectives that can inform how we address this area in the sites.
Somebody's asked if design proposals are required as part of this first round. The answer is no. We are just asking people to respond to the questions that have been outlined in the call. The second round would be a design competition where proposals would be the output. Somebody has asked about COVID conditions, and I think that as we all know, we're working in a landscape that is continuing to change, and we will continue to be responsive to public health and safety guidelines that are applicable and available in Ontario at that time. So I recognize that it is difficult to plan for 2022, but I think that we should be taking new learnings from COVID through to this competition to help to inform the design strategy. And in terms of the funding model, this is a joint effort between the Bentway, the Waterfront BIA, the Downtown West BIA, and the City of Toronto in terms of the finances for this project.
And further to that point, I saw there were some questions about the honoraria, and maybe it was answered in the chat already, but there's each of the 6 shortlisted teams will receive an honorarium of $5,000 to support the putting together detailed design proposals, and then the budget per site, I believe we have listed here. Will be between 180,000 to 230, and that's the project budget for the full project, and we'll be splitting it proportionally to support the implementation as we get closer to receiving the winning, as we come closer to the winning selection.
So just to clarify, the honorarium is for the competition. The budget here is 180 to 230 per intersection. So at minimum 180 to 230 at a maximum of a construction budget. And there are design fees in addition to that. Is it possible to have a team consisting of Canadian and international collaborators? I think as long as there is a Canadian lead, if there are additional international project participants, we would accept that application. Somebody has asked about pollution coming off of the Gardiner Expressway. I think these are exactly the types of considerations that we're hoping can be addressed through the design intervention. This is an active intersection. People cross through it on a daily basis to get down to the waterfront. And as much as we can improve the aesthetic appearance of the intersection, if we can improve the health and functional quality of the intersections, that is our hope, that those are the types of ideas that would come forward. Sam, somebody's asking about timeline for implementation.
Timelines for implementation. So this is one of the pieces that will be, I think, a complicated piece that we're going to lay out in more detail in the design brief. But we're hoping to, the challenge is that we need to coordinate with all of the other, not just the Gardner rehab work, but all of the other civic infrastructure works teams that are happening in the area. As we know, the city is a constant work in progress. And so there are contractor teams that have been identified already by our partners in the BIA office and at the city who will be working in the area. We are hoping to be able to start implementation in, I think, late 2022, but this is going to be subject to some refinement and coordination again with the other construction teams who would be in the vicinity, because what we don't want is overlapping construction teams and conflict in installation. So that's one of the pieces that we're going to refine in greater detail once we have a more clear understanding of what exactly is on the docket on the city side.
Somebody has asked for clarification about whether the 180 to 230 is inclusive of design fees, and that is the construction budget. There are design fees that will be determined as a percentage of the project budget in addition. Somebody has asked a question about clearance required for maintenance work, which is an excellent question, and I think we will be building in those parameters into the design brief that is issued at the time of the second phase of the competition. So all of that information in terms of clearances and access path and considerations for maintenance will be detailed in full in that second design brief. And just a clarification about the types of interventions that we're talking about. Really, I think that we're hoping that people think about broad possibilities for surface-based treatments as well as for other integrated design features. We're not preferencing one over the other. I think we want to ensure that the competition includes a broad range of applicants and a broad range of responses as a result.
And yeah, thinking about the full sensory experience that is there too. So not just limited to visual installations as well. I know somebody had made reference to an audio installation. That would certainly be interesting. Lighting is another challenge. So yeah, at this point, we're not trying to box it in. We'd really like to hear all of the most creative and exciting ideas. And then there's another photo here about past projects that have been done. There was the Reed Street project, which is sort of an early prototype, an early pilot project in this series, but we've also been collecting some good materials in terms of precedents that will be included in the final design brief. But at this point, we didn't include it in this presentation because we're not trying to, we don't want to influence the thinking too directly at this point. Again, trying to leave it open at high level so that we are not privileging all of your thinking with precedents this early phase. But once we get to the detailed design brief, we'll be drawing on some precedents to help illustrate the types of ideas we're looking for.
A question about the specific area of intervention and whether the columns themselves are viable sites. I would say the ramps and are not. The road surface itself would not be viable, but the columns, yes, I think there's precedent for that with the Reed Street intervention. But again, in the design brief, we will be very specific about the available area for direct intervention. And will the city or Waterfront Toronto be involved in selecting the shortlist? The City of Toronto will have representation on the selection committee, Waterfront Toronto not. But we will also be consulting with design and artistic professionals from across the city. Okay, I don't see any other open questions. I will confirm that if you have additional questions after the presentation or as you begin to put together the application, please feel free to reach out and ask. We will be posting Q&A, any questions that are received and the answers on the website. So also keep your eye on that to make sure that you're up to date on all of the relevant and recent information. And again, I just want to thank everybody for joining us here today. We're thrilled with the interest, and we're so excited to see the applications come in. So thanks again.